This Blessed Union by T-Drop. Narrated by Michael Hagiantonis. Leo normally found it easy to fall asleep on airships, with the ambient sound of wind wuthering, shifting wood, and the distantly chuffing engines. But this time, slumber was evading him as skillfully as it had the previous few nights, driven away by rampantly anxious thoughts. By the time he broke his own rule and checked his pocket watch, he was convinced that it must be 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. He was almost infuriated when the bright symbols only spelled midnight. With a frustrated groan, Leo rolled out of the bunk. He whispered a rune word to illuminate the 3 stones set into the ceiling, before bundling into his boots, jacket, and gloves. Gingerly, he took out his violin and bow and headed for the door, the light dying out as he left. The hallways and staircase were periodically lined with the same stones, large and polished, smooth like marbles, hung by metal frames. They began lighting up in a variety of pale colours at Leo's approach, and dying out once he walked past. Soft pink, light blue, and mint green reflected off the glossy dark wood of his violin while he made his way to the staircase. Leo fumbled his goggles over his eyes as he reached the top, and stepped out onto the deck. The battering wind from earlier had subsided, but the still air was now frigid in the sun's absence. The surrounding darkness was pushed back from the deck by the strand that draped from every wire, railing, and post. It was too impractical to use stones for lighting large spaces, but the long, thin strands of light-infused glass droplets were ideal. Out of the blackness, the edge of cloud banks occasionally caught the golden light cast by the strand. They would appear briefly, smoky pale phantoms that rose and vanished in the ship's wake. Air sailing was frightening enough to some people in broad daylight. At night, it could be terribly disorienting, hanging as the only bright spot in an empty black sky. But not for Leo. He'd always found the apparent isolation and drifting very peaceful and calm, similar to floating in a vast empty ocean. He breathed a little easier, staring out into the nothingness around the ship. He began pacing up and down along the railing, giving his violin a quick tune-up. The gold strand flared to white here and there, as different sailors all over the ship needed brighter light for their tasks. Gold was the easiest colour on the eyes in the dark, but was not the most ideal for work. Thankfully, Leo knew his instrument well enough that he could tune it by sound and feel alone if necessary. His fingertips were already tingling with cold, the fingerless wool gloves giving him access to the strings as a trade-off. He put the violin to his shoulder, settling comfortably into the chin rest. Leo ignored the few curious glances he felt when he started to play a few short warm-ups, the notes cutting cleanly through the still night air. He assumed if anyone took issue with his playing on deck, they would tell him. He warmed up longer than he usually would, just to test if anyone would try and stop him. When no one did, he began to play a slow, bittersweet tune that he'd been craving to play all day. He walked steadily back and forth along the railing, his eyes drifting closed now and again. Weariness clung to him, but he fought through it and kept playing. It was either play music or go back to tossing and turning. The song rolled and swelled, Leo's fingers coaxing the violin to sing the beautiful lament with almost painful ease beneath his bow. Anxiety and stress slowly fell away as Leo's entire world narrowed down to the music, the tempo, and the hypnotic flow that caught him up every time he played a piece that he'd mastered. That flow seemed to wrap around the entire deck, music pouring out to fill all the empty spaces, infusing the very air with pure, wordless emotion. That lovely, hand-carved miracle of wood and strings always allowed Leo to create entire musical worlds and escape within them. Never had he needed that escape more than now. Leo felt himself relax more than he had in days, as the strings trilled and wailed, the wood thrumming soothingly against the cradle of the chin rest. It was so intoxicating that even as the song wound to a close, Leo was deciding which to play next. He turned in his pacing, so fixated on the music that he nearly ran into William. The bow faltered in his surprise, the notes squeaking to a sudden halt. At the same instant, something small and white darted from William's shoulder straight at Leo's face. He yelped in surprise and tumbled back a few steps as he felt a furry creature scrambling about his shoulders and head. "Oh, I'm so sorry," William apologized, frantically. "Mocky, get back here." Leo almost dropped his bow to the deck when the small white mass shot down his arm with incredible speed. It jumped from his wrist and landed back on William's outstretched hands. A sigh of relief escaped Leo as he recognized the creature for what it was. "I think that little tree skimmer just took a few years off my life," he declared, breathlessly. William placed the tiny animal back on his own shoulder, and it curled against the side of his neck, clinging to the leather strap of his goggles. Large black eyes stared at Leo intensely, while tall ears and a stubby tail twitched nervously. Forgive me, Prince Leo," William apologized again. "He's very curious about people he's never met before." "Think nothing of it," Leo said, gaining his composure. I've just never had a tree skimmer jump on me before. Most of the breeds around my home are much larger and wild." The small creature made a few clicking sounds and crooning purrs, shifting around to the other side of William's neck. As it watched Leo, its head tilted to the side, showcasing two pointed canines that grew down to its furry chin. "He's not defanged," Leo noted. "Mocky here was raised tame," Will explained. "Even if he was wild caught, we'd never mutilate him like that. King Reinhairs takes issue with defanging on principle." "And he trusts you enough to take one of his pets this far from the castle?" Leo asked, slightly confused. "He's not King Reinhair's pet specifically," William explained, tugging gently on one of Mocky's oversized ears. He was essentially gifted to me once I came to Spar, because we resonated on our first meeting." Leo's eyebrows lifted in surprise. "You can resonate with animals?" "Just Mocky," William clarified. "Most people are fascinated by the rarity of it at first, until they realize how much more impressive it would be if I'd resonated with a snow saber instead. Still, Mocky is my reliable little friend, so I like keeping him nearby." Jealousy nibbled at Leo's heart. He'd spent much of his childhood dreaming of what adventures he could have with a pet, if he could resonate with one. "Must be a powerful connection if he's willing to go wherever you do, even in the middle of the night." William shrugged, and Mocky climbed down the front of his thick coat to dangle from a pocket. "It's not like he follows me everywhere, but very nearly. Once you resonate, it's almost hard to be separated." "So, what exactly are you both doing awake and above deck at this hour?" Leo noted the boy's rumpled appearance. He looked as though he dragged himself out of bed and into his deck clothes with as little finesse as Leo had. "I could ask the same of you, my lord, but honestly, I never sleep well during flights." William's blue eyes crinkled with unease behind his own goggles. "I thought a representative sent from Spa would travel by airship routinely." William shook his head. "This is my first official assignment of such importance, Prince Leo. They haven't sent me anywhere else before. I am technically just a high-ranking manservant at Castle Thrak. I have no formal training as a representative or an ambassador." A strange irritation grated at Leo unexpectedly, and he swung his bow lightly by his side, idly positioning his violin at his shoulder again for something to do. "So, this is all a big experiment for everyone." Leo instantly regretted how poisonous the words had come out, as he saw William wince nervously. Mocky chittered a bit and flicked his ears back briefly. Leo tried quickly to amend his thoughtless words. I didn't mean... Listen, it's not your fault no one seems to know what the hell they're doing. Or Maybe they do, and I'm the only one stumbling around in the dark. I couldn't say, Prince Leo, William stuttered, making Leo feel even worse. I am quite useless when it comes to untangling complex situations. Leo half turned away from William. The ones who tangled it all up to begin with seem only capable of hacking away at the mess. No surprise that they're only left with tattered shreds. William didn't respond for a long time, and Leo felt again unbearably guilty, but too stubborn to apologize. So they stood there, together, by the railing, without speaking. The distinct sounds of air travel overtook conversation. Wind whistled, cables creaked, wood moaned, engines thrummed. More subtly atop it all, the flexing and shifting of canvas whispered from the faint, ghostly shape of the sail, far overhead in the dark. Even tatters can be woven into something better than a useless tangle, William ventured at last. That's my viewpoint on the world. I might be speaking out of turn here, my lord, but I'm compelled to be honest with you. I wasn't hired to this position for my mind. I'm not wise, clever, or cunning. At most, I can be extremely polite, and that is the extent of my value as a manservant. But I believe, with every ounce of my being, that it's enough. Something about the change in William's tone made Leo look towards him again. His nervous air had been tempered by a surety that Leo hadn't expected. Most of the time I feel every bit as blind as you must feel right now, William went on, scratching at Moki's cheek with 2 fingers, while the little tree skimmer squinted huge eyes in delight. I'm very aware that I'm only working at Castle Track because my siblings do as well, and they are far more capable and valuable than I can ever hope to be. I understand feeling helpless in the face of matters far above my head. It's taught me that sometimes being torn apart and woven back together is the only way to salvage a tangled mess and find peace. Leo knew that the boy spoke truly and wisely, despite his opinion of himself. But Leo's mind had been so fixated on spotting manipulation since King Theor arrived that he couldn't switch off his cynicism. If you are trying to inspire or encourage me, Leo said tersely, I am in no mood. You can say that you understand if you want, but you've never had to face anything that I have. William suddenly reverted to his usual skittish self, and he waved his hands suddenly, eyes wide. Moki ducked into his pocket to hide. I'm sorry if I sounded impertinent, my lord. I was just stating my own experience, and you're right. It doesn't truly measure up to your own dilemma right now. Sometimes I just say whatever I feel without thinking it through. It's my greatest flaw. He sounded so apologetic that Leo's boiling irritation cooled for a second time under the sincerity of the boy's desperation. Leo might have been exhausted by the constant state of anxiety from the last 2 days, but he still couldn't bear the weight of a guilty conscience. He gave a small, shameful chuckle at how he'd behaved, and said, quietly, No, please don't, Will. I'm the one who should apologize. I've been consistently rude to you since this morning, haven't I? Forgive me. I'm generally very blunt, but I don't enjoy being unkind. This is no excuse, but I've been in such turmoil over all this that I feel like verbally thrashing anyone who so much as breathed near me. You don't deserve to be treated that way. Bright blue eyes widened even further behind his goggles, and William's mouth fell open for a stunned second as he gathered his thoughts. Oh, I see, William said slowly. But you are correct, my lord. I cannot imagine what you're going through. Honestly, I can't. I'll try not to snap at you all the same, Leo said, giving a little dip of his head. William bowed back at the waist, spilling Moki out of his pocket and forcing him to clamber up onto his shoulder again. When he straightened up again, Leo tucked his bow under his arm and reached a hand out for him to shake. The boy smiled in relief and clasped their gloved hands together. "I appreciate your compassion, my lord, but I can absorb quite a bit of snapping without any lasting harm. Growing up as a triplet ensured as much." That sparked Leo's attention, but before he could ask more about it, William went on. "At the risk of making you snap once more, I wanted to remind you that you do have a choice in all this mess. Knowing that has to help, doesn't it? Just think. If it had been a few centuries back, they'd have decided for you and set the marriage date in a single meeting of Parliament." Leo grumbled, plucking at his violin strings in annoyance. "My dad, well, my uncle, Isaac, and King Theo both stressed that point. But the more I hear it, the more I believe it's not so cut and dry. Do I really have a choice when my refusal would leave Aldonia and Spa back at the beginning? There's so much at stake. And if I do accept, what guarantee does anyone have that it will actually have a unifying effect on the citizens?" Leo felt his pulse pounding at the base of his throat as he voiced his uncertainties. "I'm honoured to be the key that unlocks future peace. If I only had absolute surety that sacrificing my current life would result in that outcome. But who can know such things? And in reality, a key is merely a tool, a means to an end. If a key does not fit the lock, what becomes of it then?" William nodded sadly at Leo's words. "I do not envy you this struggle, Prince Leo. After hearing you put it like that, being handed that choice might be crueler than anything." "It's frustrating as hell," Leo said harshly, before whipping his bow upward and playing a sudden series of trills. The small exercise helped him release a bout of stress, so he kept going while William stood there, patient and intrigued. He'd thought Moki might withdraw in fear, but the little creature actually climbed out to perch on the very cap of William's shoulder, eyes fixed on Leo's movements. The trills were almost violent in their volume and speed, the opposite of his earlier playing. He only indulged in soaring out the harsh notes for a moment, before he abruptly stopped and blurted out, in an almost disgusted rush of words, "If you put a pistol to my head and made me give an answer, I'd prefer this choice to having marriage forced on me. If there's anything I despise, it's people trying to dictate my own life, so at least I ultimately have control." Acknowledging those facts out loud seemed to further decrease the weight on his chest, and Leo took a deep breath, almost frantically in the resulting lightness. William didn't seem disturbed by his little outburst or his playing. Shay had once called Leo's use of trills during emotional times musical tantrums. However frequently Leo complained about that label, it was accurate. "You play very well, Prince Leo," William finally said. I didn't realize you'd brought an instrument." "Thank you," Leo answered softly. "Not to boast, but it's my greatest talent." "It shows. That song that you were playing when I first came on deck, was that Rorik Kavir's ballad? Slowly Winding?" Leo looked up, a bright ray of relief shining through the murk. He recognized the tone of a fellow Rorik enthusiast. "Yes, it's a string variant that I learned a few years back when it was first released on Glass. Are you a fan of his work?" "Absolutely," William answered eagerly. "I've even seen him perform at Castle Thrak once or twice before, while he was travelling through Spar." "That's incredible. I've always wanted to hear him sing in person," Leo said jealously, painfully glad to have something pleasant to discuss. "I've had plans to make any number of trips through the years, but I just never followed through." "Why is that?" William asked. "You and your family are wealthy enough, surely you could afford it." Leo hesitated, and his words came out careful and slow. "I suppose you could say that I have trouble being in crowds of people. I become uneasy." William looked thoughtful and confused. Crowds make you so uncomfortable that you've never seen your favorite bard, even though you could. Leo bit his lip nervously and looked around at the deck crew, who were all good distances away from them. I'm a Faeblood, Leo explained quietly. When I'm in a situation that makes my emotions run high, you could say that it shows. People take notice. It's difficult to explain if you don't already understand. You needn't try, William said quickly. I shouldn't be so nosy in the first place. No, it's all right, honestly. It's refreshing to meet someone who doesn't know. Impressions of my playing were added to the archive several years ago. Once those records were added, everyone discovered the truth, and I had to stop performing publicly because of it. It doesn't really matter at this point, though. Would you like me to play a song for you, so you can see for yourself? Looking slightly confused, William nodded. Oh, of course, Prince Leo. I was barely able to catch enough of that earlier tune to identify it, but I'd love to hear more. Any requests? William bit his lip as he thought for a moment. If you study Choric's songs, do you know Madly, Madly Dashing? One of the harder pieces I've learned, but yes, Leo said proudly, gesturing with his bow. Make yourself comfortable. William leaned against the railing to watch as Leo settled into a performance stance. Leo had played before people his entire life, from smaller groups or individuals in their homes to large crowds for benefit functions, or for pure entertainment for those who valued his skill. No matter how much time had passed, he was still comfortable playing for an audience. He effortlessly began the quick and difficult song with a burst of notes so fast and close together that it was disorienting. In some ways, playing a fast tune was more satisfying for Leo than the slower ones. The thrill he felt from his fingers dancing over the strings so quickly and precisely was like a potent drug, filling him with the euphoric payoff of perfection from hours of practice. As he piped the notes out, the sweet and cheery melody filled Leo with calm, despite his weariness and the speed of the piece. He sensed when he relaxed fully into it, and was carried away by the sheer beauty and joy of what he was creating. The birth of each note became more important than the one before it, until his mind and heart could focus on nothing else. It was bliss. When he sensed that peace and happiness fall over him, he heard William's small gasp of surprise. This was nothing he hadn't experienced before, and his sync with the music was too strong for him to mind the reaction. It was insignificant when he was so wrapped up in the comforting flood of notes and tempo, and his utter control over weaving them into something beautiful. It was several moments before the song came to an end, one last note snapping the piece to a close. Leo breathed slowly as the veil of reality settled around him again in the silence. He was not surprised to see all members of the deck crew standing closer than they had been before, obviously hovering and watching, captivated. It was something that Leo had come to expect over the years, whenever he played. Your eyes, William said in amazement. They're actually glowing, Leo finished for him, simply. Quite unnatural, isn't it? Will seemed unable to say anything for a while, and only stared, his hands gripping the railing behind him. Mocky was pacing excitedly from one of his shoulders to the other, back and forth, chittering. William watched the blue light shining out through Leo's goggles in disbelief and awe for a few more seconds, before he found his voice again. Like bright blue illumination, Strand. Or stones. Leo nodded, trying not to acknowledge the handfuls of men and women actively staring his way. They were attempting to return to work, but their interest was inescapable. With a sigh, Leo pulled down his goggles so that anyone watching could see that the light was coming directly from his eyes. As he exposed them, the true brightness of the glow expanded, blue light pouring onto his cheeks. He was certain he heard at least one gasp nearby. I've heard them described that way before. It's probably already fading out, though. I'm feeling self-conscious." "It is, actually," Will observed, coming a few steps closer to squint at Leo's eyes as the blue light dimmed and eventually vanished. "Do you have control over it?" Leo maneuvered his goggles back on with one hand, holding his bow and violin in the other. "No, I don't. Close as we can guess, it's representational of my mood." He almost recited the information, having done so numerous times in the last few years. "The intensity of my eye colour shifts, whether I want it to or not, depending on how I'm feeling. When I'm enjoying something with my entire being, you could say the happiness just bursts out of me, in an actual glowing light." Leo braced himself for the judgment to spread on William's face, for him to become uncomfortable and find a reason to change the subject. But the intrigue and admiration remained fixed in the boy's entire demeanour. "I've never seen a Faeblood trait that beautiful before. It's incredibly unique." On some vague level, Leo had known about the positive attitude Sparians held towards his kind. But even the handful of people he knew beyond his parents had had uneasy reactions to his eyes. William's fascination was almost unsettling. It seems a fairly useless ability, if you could even call it that. Leo lifted his violin and played a very soft and simple tune while he spoke, as if he couldn't help himself. We don't even know what Fae ancestor could have passed down something so odd. It's not like fangs or hair colour or some other obvious Fae trait. It doesn't seem to serve any purpose other than to make me stand out when I'd rather not. A small frown appeared, wrinkling between William's blonde eyebrows as he took in the words. "That's an unreasonably harsh conclusion," he said, crossing his arms over his chest and leaning back on the rails once more. "If it really just shows off your mood, isn't that the same as frowning or smiling? Unless one is very schooled at keeping one's face empty, that is quite normal, wouldn't you say?" Leo felt a tiny flicker of amusement and thankfulness in his heart at such a pure thought. He saw a small flash of blue reflect in William's goggles, a glint of joy that had briefly flared up in his eyes. The boy reacted by giving a big, toothy grin and saying, "When your eyes glow, it really is just a different way of smiling, isn't it?" Leo shut his mouth as he thought it over, still thoughtlessly playing his tune. He felt somehow both dimmer and more enlightened at the same time, seeing it from that viewpoint. Mocky broke his contemplation by making a second leap from William's shoulder to Leo's own. This time, Leo didn't flinch, and let the tiny creature flit along his bow arm and cautiously curl up against his neck. He chuckled when 8 little fingers clasped onto his ear and chin. The white and brown fur felt soft and downy as Mocky lightly rubbed his face on Leo's cheek. "No one has ever described my eyes like that before," he eventually said. "You make it sound so simple. Unfortunately, not everyone sees it that way." William seemed to realize something, and suddenly grew more cautious as he spoke. "That's why you've never gone to see Rorik perform in person. Because everyone would notice your eyes glowing." Leo nodded, and William's face hardened. "Do they really react that poorly to Faeblood in Aldonia, my lord?" Envy itched at Leo's heart. He wished he could still be as naive as William, as he had been so long ago. He felt guilty for being almost eager to shatter that innocence. "I once cost my papa, Shay, a very important business deal. I was present at the negotiations, and I became excited, realizing Shay had the upper hand. My eyes started glowing, and the other merchant noticed. He stopped the meeting immediately, saying he refused to do business with someone who had a Faeblood son. He didn't even know I was adopted." "That's horrible. In Spar, Faeblood are all but revered," William insisted earnestly. Rather than looking shattered, the boy's sweet face was marred by an anger more intense than Leo would have thought it capable of. "If that meeting had taken place with a Sparian merchant, just having you there at all would have turned the tide in your favour.
How could anyone take one look at a Fae's descendant, the last remnants of those nearly divinely magical beings, and say they are a pariah?
Leo was so taken aback by this sudden outpouring of passion that he stopped playing. He lowered his bow as William kept going, stepping away from the balcony as he went on.
There is only a tiny fraction of the Fae's magic lingering in mankind's blood, and it should be celebrated and respected. I can't believe that anyone can disagree, much less treat Faeblood so heartlessly.
There was a pause. Moki found his way across Leo's shoulders to his now silent violin, and began nervously testing the strings. He kept plucking at them and drawing back, startled, each time they made a sound. It made Leo chuckle, and when William noticed, he did as well. He scratched the back of his neck, melting back into calmness. I didn't mean to go off like that, my lord. This prejudice is just very unfamiliar to me. I've always lived with like-minded people, so hearing about such an absurd way of thinking, it irked me. In my country, Faeblood were spoken of as though they were deities. They, or, well, you, have substantial amounts of magical energies flowing through you from your Fae ancestors. It's akin to being the descendant of a god. A bark of pure laughter left Leo's chest, and he had to lower his violin from his shoulder abruptly. Moki darted straight up and over his head, to land on his other shoulder at the sharp movement. Ha! I have terribly disappointing news for you, Will. I'm just a normal human without any more power than anyone else. I haven't found being a Faeblood significantly beneficial in any way. If anything, it's made my life far worse. William frowned.
But King Reinhers has proven to be blessed with Faeblood magic, and he's the best-known Faeblood in nearly all of the world. His legendary Fireblade...
Great mages can come from anywhere, Leo cut in wearily. It doesn't have to be anything to do with being a Faeblood.
That could be true, William said delicately but firmly. But even beyond King Reinhers, there is a distinguishing pattern of Faeblood having overwhelming magical abilities that outrank common folk.
Not in my case, Leo chuckled. I've yet to discover any significant magical ability at all, let alone anything as impressive as what King Reinhers can do.
Not all Faeblood have impressive bombastic magic, Will insisted, but they most certainly do have an aura, if nothing else.
Leo raised an eyebrow. An aura?
Indeed,
William said, looking delighted, as if he was sharing a secret he'd been keeping for years.
Brom, one of the royal archivists, described it to me as a sort of sphere of influence. What your aura influences and for what purpose varies depending on the person. But apparently all Faeblood possess one. It could mean wild animals are tame around you, or that people naturally trust you. See? I think Brom even mentioned something as extreme as rapid healing or rejuvenation by being in the right Faeblood's presence, or within their sphere of influence.
Leo felt quite suddenly inadequate, like a child being dropped into a class that was levels above their previous schooling. He'd brushed off most of the whisperings he'd heard about his kind, because for the most part, they'd sounded ridiculous. But William spoke with such surety that it cast doubt in his mind as to which rumours might be true.
Royal archivists? He asked, quietly, swallowing his pride.
Are they parallel to the scribes of Voldonia?
Similar, yes. They are the keepers of the entire collected knowledge of Spar, William explained. The royal library is so vast that without the archivists' extensive cataloguing over the ages, there would be no way to navigate it. They've been incredibly busy for nearly a decade, slowly recording impressions of each volume and scroll, so they can be saved from the erosion of time and preserved in the archives.
That made Leo wonder if Voldonia had an equivalent store of knowledge. Surely the capital of Saldranor had to house such a place. Why else would the scribes be kept? Though, Faeblood records might have been expunged for the same superstitious reasons Leo had been cast out. In Spar, however, are these archivists knowledgeable about Faeblood? William turned a proud grin on Leo.
I haven't questioned them about it extensively, But they would know more than anyone alive. I'd bet my own boots on that.
Leo's interest was piqued. His entire life had been riddled with questions about himself and his own kind. Perhaps, if nothing else came of this journey, he could finally find some answers. Leo tapped his violin bow against his leg again, chewing on his lip in thought, before William asked, "Are you interested in speaking with the archivists, my lord? I would gladly introduce you to the ones I know. If you request an audience with them, I'm certain they would all leap at the chance to meet you." Blue light leapt into Leo's eyes again, but he closed them quickly, stifling his hope. It was too soon, or too late, for wishful thinking. One matter at a time. "William, thank you, but truthfully, you're exhausting me with your optimism. I'm very tired, and I can hardly plan beyond tomorrow. I think I'll return to my cabin and try to sleep again." The boy looked understanding and subtly took a few steps away from Leo, as though giving him space to leave.
"Pardon me, my lord, but would a sleeping potion help?"
"Perhaps a few more doses," Leo said, lifting a careful hand to stroke Moki's fur and being met with soft purring. "But I'm trying to conserve my stock until we arrive in Spa. I suspect I'll need more to get through my times there."
"But, my lord, if you require anything at all, the entire staff of this airship and the royal castle of Thrak is at your disposal. I can simply have the airship maid or technician make some for you this very moment."
I don't want to be a bother," Leo said, almost shyly, turning to head for the doorway to the lower decks. Will followed.
"Why would it be a bother, Prince Leo? Servants are here to serve."
William closed the door behind them, blocking out the sounds of wind and canvas as they descended into the quiet.
"You never have to hesitate to order us about."
Moki jumped from Leo's shoulders to scale down the railing alongside them. Leo made a small, apologetic sound. "My dad, Uncle Isaac. Since he is a lord, he grew up very spoiled, and still has trouble being self-sufficient to this day. So when he and my Papa Shay adopted me, they agreed to use servants as little as possible. I was taught not to bother them unless I had a good reason for not doing something myself." He could hear the interest in the boy's voice as he asked,
"So, what do your servants even do in that case?"
"We don't keep a full staff. They rotate depending on the day. We only have a cook 2 days a week, or for very special occasions. A gardener on one day, the washing done another, you see."
"I've never heard of a household as wealthy as yours running in such a way," William said with interest. "Most days you're all fending for yourselves."
Leo nodded, oddly smug. I didn't realize until I began mingling with others my own age that it was strange. I'm grateful that I never became too reliant, but it may make it hard for me to use your services so freely, or ask for things I need. But I'll take advantage of your offer for a sleeping potion. I never sleep a wink without it when I'm stressed."
"Think nothing of it, my lord. We all need a bit of help sometimes. I shall have the potion made for you immediately."
Moki began darting down the hallway ahead of them, causing the rows of stones to rapidly light up and fade out as he passed. They reached Leo's cabin at a slower pace, and as he was opening the door, Leo turned to ask, "You said that you have trouble sleeping on airships. So how do you cope? Do you take a potion as well?" William fiddled with his goggles, a sheepish, uncertain smile on his face as he pulled them off.
"No, my lord. I usually imagine that I'm somewhere else to help me relax. It's similar to meditation, and it usually works. But sometimes I can't focus enough the first time, and getting up for a little walk helps when I go back to try again. That's why I was on deck, just like you."
"So, you just imagine yourself somewhere, anywhere else, and that works?" Leo asked, trying to decide if he would have the mental patience and focus to try William's tactic.
"I don't have to very often," William prefaced. "I hardly ever have to board an airship in the first place. But when I do, this ritual serves me well."
"May I ask?"
Where do you imagine yourself?" Mocky circled back to them and climbed up William's leg and coat to rest in the crook of his arm. William scratched one side of his head, and Leo reached out to scratch the other. The little creature wobbled his head lazily between both of their attentions. With a smile, William answered Leo's question. "When I first decided to test it, I was trying to think of any place directly opposite of the sky. A meadow? A cave? Somewhere grounded in the earth. Strangely, the one that ended up working the best for me is when I imagine I'm floating in a pond. When I imagine myself drifting through water. It seems to fit what I'm actually feeling in my bunk on the airship, but safer. When I imagine that the miles of empty air around me is water instead, it helps. It's the only reason I ever get any sleep on airships." Something in Leo's heart turned over with interest, and he swallowed slightly. "That sounds very calming. I might just try that in addition to my potion." William smiled happily. "I would love to have aided in your relaxation, Prince Leo, but please, do not pressure yourself by trying too hard. It works for me, but it might not for you." Leo shook his head, with a weary little sigh. "There is nothing more tranquil to me than being surrounded by water. I grew up on the ocean." William's smile softened, and he inclined his head. "Then perhaps it may have an even greater effect for you than it does me, Prince Leo. In any case, I shall return with your sleeping potion shortly." Leo bowed in return. "Thank you, Will. I greatly appreciate it." Will turned to leave, and Leo closed his door. He shrugged out of his jacket and boots, before wondering if it was just his imagination that the cabin felt colder. He frowned and pulled on an extra tunic, already resenting the amount of heavy clothing he'd be forced to purchase once in Spa just to stay warm. Images of furs and wools and heavy knits swirled in his head as he laid down in his bunk. Leo was surprised by how appealing they all became the longer he thought on them. Northern garb had to be thick and warm by necessity, and he'd seen impressions of citizens trussed up in outerwear so heavy he wondered how they moved. Thrak was not the northernmost town in Spa, so Leo hoped that level of extreme cold weather was not as prevalent there. Rorik was Sparian, and from what Leo had read, his hometown was nowhere near as cold throughout the year. Before he could find out just how cold Spa was, they would have to get there first, by navigating the shudder. Leo felt himself break out into goosebumps at the notion. He wondered if it would be better or worse to hide in his cabin and cover the window, rather than watching the ship wind sharply between sharp walls of mountain stone. He couldn't let himself think about that, not right now, when he needed to fall asleep. There was already more than enough to keep him anxious and awake, without adding potential death to the list.